It was supposed to only be a short visit to the park. Instead, he had been AWOL for hours, and before he had even opened the door, he sensed how pissed off she was going to be. Sure enough, when he checked his phone, there were 3 missed calls, blinking off and on like little electronic signals of reproach, and his heart immediately started to sink at the sight of them. He didn't have the energy for one of Florence's scenes. He didn't. In regular circumstances, it would be bad enough. But the fact that he was supposed to be being careful and keeping their whereabouts known to each other would mean this would be a scene like a carefully curated masterwork of artful antipathy, sizzling and smoking with silent resentment, in which she would be able to indicate enormous offense being taken without having to speak a solitary word to confirm it. The whole thing would be exhausting, and more than a little unnerving, because despite how the atmosphere choked with foreboding, it was always impossible to tell what she was thinking. If she just yelled at him and called him an inconsiderate asshole, it would be easier, but instead she would simmer away and let him second-guess the situation until his nerves were completely frayed. It was like she could be genuinely, angrily, or secretly amused, and he would rarely know for sure. He now unlocked the door and cautiously glanced around the hallway before dumping his keys on the table. He was expecting an immediate confrontation, but there was no sign of her anywhere, and he was just starting to wonder if she had gone AWOL herself in revenge when he went into the kitchen and caught a faint waft of her perfume. It was very distinctive, a bit like a calling card, and he was just about to call her name when her voice promptly shot out behind him and snapped,
"Where have you been?"
He swung around sharply on both his heels, but still could not see where she was. It was a little creepy. He knew she was doing it on purpose. It was also frustrating, because while the kitchen was large, it was not that large, not enough for her to get fully lost in. He squinted around for a few seconds and finally located her in the corner, slightly camouflaged by the stretch of shadows that always fell across the house at that time in the afternoon.
Out.
The annoyance was obvious. He was intending to be more apologetic, but the tension of the last few hours was making him irritable.
I popped out for a walk.
You didn't answer your phone.
I guess I didn't.
He supposed this would be a good time to employ some of these de-escalation skills he had been practicing, but a part of him honestly couldn't be bothered. It was ironic, really. He leaned against the counter instead, then folded both arms, deliberately defiant and combative.
Weird, isn't it? Anyone would think I was a full-grown adult.
You promised me you'd be careful. How is leaving the house for 2 hours and not telling me where the fuck you are careful?
Because I can take care of myself.
Fucking bullshit, Angus. You know exactly what I mean. So stop prevaricating.
You need to be careful how you talk to me, Florence. You forget yourself.
You pig-headed, selfish prick.
He stared at her without replying, and she was thinking he was about to back down when he strode towards her, hemming her against the kitchen counter and cupped her face in his hand. She hated it when he did this. The past association always made her feel like it was a power move. The fact that he had chosen to do it to her in a corner didn't exactly help, and she let out her breath in an angry hiss, then jerked her head away. If she was honest, it was actually kind of depressing, because these moments were such a strong reminder that she still hadn't overcome her instinctive urge to fight him off whenever he tried to grab her. His eyes narrowed with annoyance, and he waited a few moments before calmly reaching out to do it again, this time with both hands, so it was harder for her to get free.
Stop it! Get off me!
She was not expecting him to listen, and of course he didn't. Instead, he tightened his grip and then made a sort of humming noise through his teeth. This might have been meant to be soothing, but by this point it was honestly impossible to tell.
I don't like not knowing where you are.
I told you where I was.
You were gone a very long time, Angus. I was frightened.
I was gone for a few hours. Can't you just...
He was going to tell her to relax, but somehow it didn't feel right because she was always supernaturally relaxed, at least on the surface. He proceeded to audition and reject a series of increasingly inappropriate alternatives. Stop nagging me. before finally settling on,
Just give me a bit of space.
She carried on staring at him while he was speaking, eyes laser-focused with the familiar intensity.
No, Angus, that's not fair. Possessiveness is a consequence of love, just as anger is a consequence of care. If I cared less, I would not give a shit where you went.
Oh, for goodness sake, Florence!
She was just starting to forge a new argument about how he could be so self-centered when she felt his grip on her tighten again. The touch was light enough not to hurt her, but firm enough to indicate displeasure with her behavior. It was then she smelt it. Her eyes widened, and she inhaled sharply, and he suddenly knew exactly what was about to happen.
You've been with another woman.
Her voice had audibly changed, no longer rhythmic, but taut and brittle with resentment.
Who was it?
No one.
No one who wears Chanel No. 5?
He could have kicked himself for not preempting this sooner. Although short of showering and changing his clothes to wash the smell off, it was hard to know what else he could have done. He supposed this was his cue to tell her what had happened. But in that moment, he knew he wasn't going to. Possibly this was a mistake. In fact, it most certainly was, seeing how likely it would be that she would find out anyway. Even so, delaying the problem a little longer had a powerful appeal, because once she had discovered that he had met the lady from the photograph, he knew she would not be able to rest until she had had a chance to see her herself.
No one. At least no one important. Just someone from the clergy.
Who from the fucking clergy?
Okay, enough!
Angus tightened his grip harder around her chin.
Angus, stop it!
She jarred her hand up to roughly knock his hands away and then took a few steps backward until she was out of touching distance.
I didn't know who they were. I hadn't met them before. She recognized me from a photo.
Remembering their conversation, he gave an involuntary twitch.
Even more to the point, she knows who you are. So it was good that I was able to swiftly take her away from any areas that you might be found in and have conversations with her about your decapitation.
For a few seconds, she just stared at him, eyes wide.
She wanted you to spend time with her?
He had a sudden urge to bellow.
Well, obviously she did. Florence, use your brain for once.
Just for the satisfaction of seeing the look on her face. Not to mention the total lack of comprehension.
What did you just say to me?
She is here as part of the Il Impuro task force,
he said instead with obvious impatience.
And speaking of which, here's some more news for you. She told me that Giovanni was on his way. He's arriving tomorrow.
This was the bombshell news he had been waiting to drop, and which instead of provoking any sort of reaction from her, just bounced straight off again with no obvious effect. Sometimes he wondered why he even bothered.
So late? I thought he would have been here by now. Good old Giovanni. Always the last one to the party. Well, the Catholic Church in general is a bit of an almighty embarrassment at the moment, isn't it?
While he knew it was a deliberate attempt to bait him, the mocking way in which she dismissed the church's competence managed to strike a serious nerve. Most likely Carly's references to his reputation set it off too, but either way, it has stoked up the memory of how much trouble she had caused him and how much her existence made him not only lose confidence in his ability to do his job, but also made him doubt his faith. For a few moments, the old urge to storm and crush her was almost overwhelming, and he finally had to redirect it into an angry shuffling motion with his feet before throwing a glare in her direction, which she threw back and then walked to the other side of the kitchen further away from him. It was strange to think she would once have been much too wary to take her eye off of him when he was angry. Now it didn't even occur to her to feel concerned about what he might decide to do when her back was turned. Besides, whilst it was mostly to get a bit of distance, it was also to forage for food because she was starving. She was ravenous. She began to rifle through the cupboard like an eager rodent, only pausing to turn around when he added over her shoulder,
From tomorrow onwards, I want you to stay inside.
As soon as he said this, her eyes narrowed again. She was annoyed he could tell. She never liked being told what to do. Ironically, she seemed content to go along with his demands most of the time, but every so often she would call his bluff and outright refuse to acknowledge a single thing he asked her. He suspected she did it on purpose to disorientate him because heaven forbid she was ever easy to predict.
I beg your pardon?
She stared back at him and then blinked a few times. The last time he heard anyone say this out loud was in an English TV drama where the whole cast was wearing bonnets and electricity hadn't been invented. Goodness knows how she was able to conjure up these old colloquialisms and still sound edgy. It was like some kind of superpower that she had. In the end, he simply repeated the scowling expression, just in time for her to add,
That is not what we agreed.
I know we didn't. Isn't it frustrating to be controlled again, my dove? But if I cared less, I would neglect you more.
Needless to say, she did not attempt to acknowledge this double standard. She was infuriating sometimes. Most people would have the decency to at least pretend to be ashamed at having their rubbish thrown straight back at them. Instead, she glared at him with anger.
What about you?
As you know, I have a considerable aversion to hiding away from Giovanni.
Yes, I know you do. You also are in a relationship with the girl he lusted after. And through my discovery, we'll find out what a fool you made of him.
Exactly.
And so you wish to have me under house arrest?
She abandoned the cupboard and then opened the fridge instead, rummaging around for a few seconds before crossly slamming it shut.
House arrest would drive me mad. I'll feel like I was back in prison. You'll be locking me back up again. It would be the same as your house. I couldn't.
He made an irritated sighing sound, and she finally glanced up for long enough to throw him a glare.
What you're proposing would undo everything we've tried to forget.
This time he didn't reply at all. Possibly he was still struggling not to lose his temper. He always hated being reminded of his past depravity, but by this point she had run out of shits to give and was completely past caring whether she was offending him or not. Besides, she knew he wouldn't lose his temper, mostly because he barely did anymore, but also because he was aware she was goading him on purpose to get a reaction from him and would deliberately stay in control to deny her the satisfaction of getting one. Sure enough, when she turned around again, she was standing exactly where she was before, his features arranged into his favorite, fantasized Mona Lisa expression of complacent calmness. She always found this incredibly aggravating. Sometimes she even fantasized about trying to slap it off him, and probably would, except for the fact that she knew that she would just find another, slightly smaller smug look straight beneath the first one.
We've discussed this already. We've discussed it at length. Consequently, the discussion is closed. You can't revert to your position of a week ago with no explanation and reasonably expect me to agree.
I've already explained it. He's coming tomorrow. You need to not be out in the city.
We should have left Mexico, damn you, Angus.
I understand this is a terrible shock, but we must adapt to the circumstances that we find ourselves in, not to the ones we wish for. It was all understood that we should be wary of you coming and going, whilst Giovanni was in the area. We will adopt a bit more of a curfew and be safe. I have no desire to see you locked up, Florence. I just would rather you be secure and safe than apart from me and dead in a ditch. See sense.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that optimistic analogy.
He smiled.
Are you hungry?
I am. I'm starving.
Let me make you some lunch.
His tone sounded unusually placatory, and it occurred to her that this was his way to keep the peace. She supposed he had now realized how much Giovanni's arrival had freaked her out. Not that this does him much credit. He's have to be blind and deaf not to realize. More to the point, it was clear that he also understood how much his recklessness of any kind of consequence is walking a fine line of pushing her to a limit. Although surely he must also know that she would never give up on him. She was not sure, really. It was hard to say. She spent so much time second-guessing him that she sometimes forgot that he might do the same. Only she didn't know how to explain any of this, so in the end she muttered something appreciative and then sat down at the table instead and tried to look less bad-tempered as he started to assemble plates and pans. He ended up making her gnocchi, which she had recently discovered she had a bit of an addiction to. She had had it before in restaurants, but this was always better. If she were cooking it herself, she would just dump a jar of sauce over it. But he boiled it for a few minutes in salted water and then fried it in gleaming garlic butter until it was light and crispy.
Not fry, Florence,
He always said,
sauté.
to which she replied,
Oh, yeah.
before demolishing the entire lot like someone half-starved. It was far nicer when it had been sautéed. This time was no exception, and he pulled up a chair to watch her eating it, while she did her best to ignore him. This wasn't especially hard because she was so used to it by now. He had always enjoyed feeding her, and it was yet another item to the list of things she ought to find creepy, but she could no longer bring herself to care about. She devoured the gnocchi in record time, and then gave a contented sigh and pushed the plate away.
That was great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
He reached across the table to press the back of her hand, which was about as close as he ever got to apologizing.
It is still early. Why don't we go out for a while?
Are you joking? You've just told me there's a clergywoman in town who knows who I am, and that I should be dead.
A clergywoman who I met on a lunch break. And take my word for it, clergymen who get flown to Mexico at taxpayer expense are an industrious breed. I should say there is no chance of her leaving the church until 6 p.m. at the earliest.
He gave one of his more feline smiles, and then extended a forefinger to brush along the edge of her wrist.
Facts of which you are already well aware. You remember my hours at the cathedral?
Whilst this is undeniably true, she still can't quite shake her reservations about it.
Well, perhaps. But we should go somewhere touristy. Somewhere there is no chance she will be.
Agreed.
And I shall wear a hat.
This made him smile slightly.
If you like.
Left to her own devices, she probably would have forgotten to grab one, so he stalked off and grabbed one for her himself and a pair of sunglasses, then stood over her while she put them on. She suited them both surprisingly well. The hat gave her an elegant European air, whilst the glasses accentuated her cheekbones and complemented the curve of her forehead. They suited her.
Okay then,
He said when she had finished.
where would you like to go?
Wherever you think is best. After all, today is the final day with no restrictions.
Although it hasn't escaped him that she had never agreed to stay out of sight whilst Giovanni was here, this last statement felt like she was least acknowledging his concerns about it. He supposed it was progress. Sort of. Admitting the restrictions existed didn't mean she would follow them. Who was he kidding? Of course she wouldn't. He had failed to keep her inside of a room in his own house under lock and key, and with 2 guards. But for the moment they seemed to at least be approaching something resembling the same page. Or the same book, maybe. The same library. Even so, they had been arguing so much lately. He was glad to accept the ceasefire, and finally suggested spending the afternoon at Lake Texcoco. They had gone there quite a few times in the past few weeks, and Florence had developed a secret mania for the sandpipers. She had. He found it secretly adorable that she liked to look at something cute and fluffy now and then, and her face lighting up when the sandpipers bumble by the waterside, gutsy and hilarious with their beady little eyes, and she sits next to him on the bench to watch them whilst he reads his book, his other arm casually resting on the back of the bench so he can stroke her neck. One of the sandpipers waddled past her foot, and she felt herself smile for what seemed like the first time in days.
Did you know, by the way, that swans can break a person's arm? At least I've heard they can. It is probably one of those urban legends. The same about lemmings running over cliffs. I still hope it is true, though. The swans seem so fragile and elegant with their delicate necks. So it's reassuring that they can be capable of quite rugged self-defense. It would be quite an enjoyable life being a swan. An extremely easy, straightforward kind of life, gliding around, looking elegant, eating bread, and breaking people's arms.
Beside her, she could see him starting to smile. Most people would get annoyed listening to her blurt out random bits of mental crap, but she knew he found it endearing.
They are very impressive creatures. They are also very devoted.
He paused, then gently increased the pressure on her neck.
After finding a suitable mate, then 2 swans will pair for life.
This made her groan a bit and rolled her eyes, although she was smiling while she did it. He smiled back and then disappeared behind his book again, allowing his fingers to wander upwards to lightly stroke the hair at the base of her neck. It felt very intimate, although it was about as far as he would go without explicit invitation, because he knew she didn't like him touching her too much in public. She often felt faintly ashamed of this reluctance, but she had never been a demonstrative person, and there was something about public displays of affection which were guaranteed to make her cringe. It was stupid, really. Most couples don't have a problem with it, and it was not like she cared what any onlookers might think. Why did it bother her so much? Perhaps it was a sign of some deep-seated hang-up, or maybe she was sexually repressed. Oh God, she bet she was. She bet she was sexually repressed.
Hey, do you think I'm sexually repressed?
There was a pause before his eyes reappeared from the top of his book to stare at her.
You?
She supposed this should be reassuring, but somehow it manages to seem even worse. It was his surprised tone, she thought. It was like he might as well be saying,
My dear Florence, you know as well as I do that you are the most enormous slut.
The rest of his face now appeared, and from the faint smile on his face, it was obvious he had worked out what she was thinking.
You are not remotely sexually repressed, although perhaps a little emotionally inhibited at times.
Right. That's not that much better, though, is it?
It is not a question of better or worse.
His smile had started to broaden slightly. It occurred to her he might be struggling not to laugh.
Why this sudden introspection? Is it because we're together in public?
I guess.
You guess, do you? I suspect you know, although I won't force you to describe it if you don't want to.
You couldn't force me, genius. Not if I didn't want to.
By now his eyes looked like they were gleaming, and she had an awful feeling he might be about to pounce on her, and then stick his tongue down her throat in front of all the assembled mothers and toddlers just to prove a point. She was so convinced she started having preemptive images of all the scandalized glares and comportamiento repugnante because of their age gap. But in the end, he just smirked again, then trailed his finger across her forearm before vanishing behind the book again. Perversely, a part of her now wished he would reappear so she could talk to him, but there was no doubt it was more secure to have him hidden from view. Perhaps she could just knock on the front of the paper to get his attention as if it were a door. Either that or blurt out a few more random observations about swans and sexual repression. A few more minutes went past, but it was clear he was not coming out again. So she leaned back against the bench, then closed her eyes as she started to daydream about what it would be like to have the sort of life where they didn't have to keep looking over their shoulders. This was soothing, and after a bit of thought, she decided she was going to put them in a house in the countryside. Despite the fact this was discussed and then discarded in real life, partly because of the difficulties in getting the right property tax, but mostly because he was too sophisticated to be away from structured society for more than a few weeks at a time. Oh well, fuck it. It was her fantasy. She could do whatever she wanted. The house in her mind was very sprawling and rustic looking, possibly a discarded farmhouse, and was built from stone, the same pale gold as Labrador puppies, with grey slates on the roof and lots of dark wooden window frames. 2 stories would probably be enough, although she decided to add a basement for him to use as a wine cellar, followed by a large dusty attic that she could surprise him with by renovating into a library with rows of bookshelves that she'd build herself. After that, she included a kitchen with a La Cornue range and a rack filled with gleaming copper pans, then planted a herb garden for him outside the back door before turning her attention to the front of the house. She would plant some trees, large twining cherries that would shower confetti in the spring and drip with fruit in the fall. Then add a few tubs of lavender and ficus, followed by a porch swing that they could sit and bicker in every evening while they watched the sunset, and occasionally fall asleep on with her head across his knee. As a finishing touch, she added a few dogs to the image to make it perfect, then contentedly stretched out again and let her foot rest against his. In the early days, she used to wonder how it would ever be possible to combine such discordant tastes and temperaments in a shared home, yet somehow they still seemed to have managed it. She rarely even thought about it anymore, content in the knowledge that there was a side of him that could learn to tolerate mud and dog hairs right next to a side of her who would drink vintage wine whilst listening to classical music, both of whom could peacefully coexist and even learn to enjoy it.
Te amo, Angus,
she said quietly. The sun was making her drowsy, and as he increased the stroking on her neck, she let out a small, contented noise. He dipped his thumb beneath her collar in response, gently rubbing the skin as his fingers curled around her neck to brush the edge of her jaw. It was such a small gesture, yet somehow felt far more intimate than if he had kissed her. They should go home right now, she thought. They should go home and go straight to bed. To be honest, it was probably a bit too hot for it. But by this point she didn't care. She wanted to feel his weight pressed on top of her, her skin growing warm and damp as their tongues slid together, then gazing into each other's eyes the entire time as his hands explored every part of her body. Abruptly, she pulled herself upright, snapping her eyes open as she swiveled around to look at him. Her mouth was moving, already on the verge of suggesting it, but before the words could form, she found herself going deadly silent as each one of her muscles seemed to contract itself with shock. The sensation was enough to make her flinch almost violently, but as he turned to stare at her, her eyes slid straight past him, fixated in horror at the pathway that wound across the parkland just beyond his shoulder.
Oh God,
she said faintly, and her voice seemed very far away.
Oh shit.
For a few seconds, it was like everything was in slow motion, dulled sound, muted shadows, before she came jolting back to life, and it all roared into focus again with a blare of noise and color. The only saving grace was that they were too far away to be seen, but she knew that grace was a fleeting one because it couldn't be that much longer. Not more than a few minutes. Then she was aware of a chaotic kaleidoscope of emotion. Fear, confusion, anger, resentment, because she was not even sure how it had happened. How has it happened? How was it even possible? But regardless of the hows and the whys, there was no doubt it finally had, and he was finally here, a full 24 hours sooner than he should have been, but no less real because of it. Giovanni Pacha, walking straight in their direction,